Hey guys, Travis here. Thank you all so much for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't yet and hit that notification bell to keep in the loop. Enjoy today's podcast. Today I'm speaking with Coleman Hughes. He is an undergraduate philosophy major at Columbia University. His writing has been featured in Heterodox, Academy's blog, in the Columbia Spectre, and in one of my favorite publications, Colette. Everyone should go out and check out Colette. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Coleman. Been looking forward to chatting with you.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
Awesome. So first of all, how is life? What's keeping you busy? What's new?
I'm pretty good. I'm searching for an apartment right now, so that's occupying most of my time and energy. But I think I found the right one today, and that's where I'm at.
And are you based in New York City?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are housing prices like there? It must be pretty crazy.
They are pretty crazy.
Yeah.
They are pretty good, but it's not quite as bad as the dorms. So
Right.
I'm actually saving money by living off campus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's good.
Yeah.
So that's cool. And so on November 17th, you'll be joining us for a day of reflection for our conference in New York City. And you're going to be on the panel with Kamel Foster, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Glenn Lowry, and others, and the topic is, can we move beyond race? And I thought the first question we could start with is race still a major problem in the U.S.?
No, I don't think it's a major problem. It certainly used to be a major problem. Obviously, we had slavery, then we had racist policies in the postbellum South, then we had after the Great Migration North, racist housing policies, racist lending policies in the North, racist New Deal era policies. We had a civil rights movement in the 60s that, it gave protections that Black people still enjoy today. And it's not to say that those protections have been implemented perfectly, but racism is absolutely not the primary problem facing Black people at this moment, which is not to say that there is no racism. Yes, racism exists. There will always be instances of racism in a country with 300 plus million people. If you think about it just in terms of statistics, an event that has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to a specific person on a specific day will happen in America twice a week to someone somewhere. And as long as there's somebody there to film it, it will seem as if there's an epidemic of some kind of event happening, when in reality, that event has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to any specific person on any given day. So there is our intuitions about probability are poorly aligned with the incentives facing journalists, which are to cover every outlier event and make it seem like a trend. I think most Black people don't see racism anymore as the biggest problem they face. There was a Gallup poll in 2013 which found that 60% of Black people said bias was not the main issue they faced in terms of income and housing and jobs. Now you might say, well, 40% say it is. Well, fair enough. But the point is that that's a majority view at this point, and much of the hysteria around this issue is the fact that people read the news or they watch the news and they see these one-off events happening to other people, assume it's more widespread than it is, and they get their sense of where America is from that, which is the wrong place to get it from.
Right. Do you see a fair amount of racism towards other races as well? White, Asian people. Is it as much of a problem for those people now as it is for the Black community, or is there some percentage you can put to it to quantify exactly how you think that how racisms break down in society?
That's hard. I mean, it's hard to quantify it. One thing to note is just that people are not statistical averages. So it's one thing to say X% of black people experience racism and X% of white people experience racism, or Asian people, for example, but it's another thing to internalize that statistic if you're not, in fact, one of the people, right? If we're talking about over 50% of every ethnicity at this point is not facing any kind of major bias in their life, then it doesn't make so much sense to be splitting hairs about who's getting it worse. I mean, I have a white friend I was hanging out with 2 days ago, told me a story about being on the subway, and a black guy who may have been, he was just acting strange and sort of aggressive, made a lot of eye contact with my friend, and just starts threatening him. Just looks him right in the eye, threats him, calls him names for being white. Just like totally scaring everyone on the subway. Just really, really. I mean, that stuff happens. That stuff happens to white people sometimes. Obviously, in terms of applying to colleges, Asians are formally discriminated against, as we now know from the Harvard scandal, even though we have known this for decades at this point. Yeah, I mean, let's even expand it outside of race. There are 1,000 axes along which one can be discriminated against in life. You put people in the lab, you find that they respond more to men with deeper voices than to men with higher voices. You could show bias. You can show bias. If you're short and you say the same thing as someone who's tall, you could get people in a lab and show that they're biased towards the tall person or towards the person with greater facial symmetry. But there's no reason in principle to be zeroing in on race as the most important axis along which to discuss people's relative privilege or disadvantage. It's one of 1,000 variables in life that could contribute to one having a local privilege in one's day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to make, that people are individuals, and hopefully we can make judgments on those people's ideas as opposed to the color of their skin or any sexisms as well. I think sexism is seems to be making a comeback these days, and I see a lot still towards women, but I also see a lot towards men. So I hope we can move away from these tribal ways of thinking. Is this possible for a species like the human race, or are we going to be always stuck in this as long as we have diversity?
I read an article yesterday. I can't remember who it was by. It was Douglas Murray, British author.
Yeah, I know Douglas.
Speaks.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, wasn't he on this podcast?
Yep, yeah, he came on the podcast, and we just we've done a few events with him. He was part of the big events over in Dublin and London as well.
Yeah. So Douglas wrote an article about anti-Semitism and the relationship between anti-Semitism and the political spectrum. Where does it come from, the right or the left or both? He talks about this book, Power and the Idealist by Paul Berman. Anyway, there was a little section in there where somebody had the idea that anti-Semitism would be eradicated one day, or it was their goal to eradicate anti-Semitism. And Douglas Murray said something like, every Jewish person I know would laugh at the idea that anti-Semitism will ever be completely extinguished. Right. Which I think is interesting. I mean, it's worth reflecting. I mean, I think many people have the idea that something like sexism, for instance, will go away completely. I think it may just not be true. The truth about human nature could be a bit more tragic than that. It could be the case that as long as we continue to be the kind of genetic creatures, apes really, that we are, we will have these kinds of biases. And obviously that's not a case for not trying to eliminate the bias. Right. But it is a case for the fact that there will be diminishing returns at some point. There will be some amount of bias harbored in people's hearts unconsciously or consciously, frankly, that the cost of trying to get rid of it will at some point begin to exceed the benefit we get from trying to get rid of it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, as long as we have, sexual selectivity, it's like, in a sense, we're creating, or we're committing these a certain amount of sexisms with all the decisions we make as a social species. So, is it sexist for one to just prefer, a sexual partner of the opposite sex?
Mm-hmm. Luckily, I guess we haven't gotten that crazy yet.
Yeah.
But I guess you could also, it's interesting, you can make the point with something like murder. I think most people, I want to get your sense of this. Most people I know would never expect the murder rate to drop to 0. Right? Like, most people know that there's just a certain amount of murder that will happen, and that what we would have to do to get the murder rate to 0 would be absolutely totalitarian and not worth it. And it seems like something like that could be very true of racism, sexism, homophobia. It could be that you get a lot of gains when reducing it at first, and then you hit diminishing returns. Yeah,
this kind of reminds me of a thought experiment I was thinking of when it comes to pedophilia, because if we get this new technology, this brain scan technology, when a baby's born, we scan the brain and say, oh, there's the gene for pedophilia, or whatever indicator we find. It's like, what is to be done about that person? It's like, if we know the thinking and the ideas are going to be formed in a certain way, it's like, do we still award that person the opportunity, or do we get ahead of it? And I guess getting ahead of things like this can ultimately erode some of your freedoms and your potential accesses to certain pleasures.
Yeah, I'm actually not so concerned about that, only just because my lay understanding of genetics is that there's almost never a gene for X, where X is some bad pathology. Like, even something like schizophrenia, for example, when they do the identical twins separated at birth studies, they find genes predict something like 50% of your likelihood of getting schizophrenia, but it's never 100%.
Right. I guess maybe if
the point still stands.
Yeah.
I guess the point still stands. Like, if you know someone has a gene that makes this more likely, do you start an intervention when they're a kid? How do you respond to that? Those are valid questions.
Yeah, and I think and the likeliness matters. Like, if all of a sudden we know that this child, if we can detect as soon as the child or the egg's been fertilized, we can tell that this baby is going to turn out to be a serial killer or something, no one wants to have around. It's like, do we move on to the next viable embryo or egg, or do we give them that opportunity? I think there's
right.
some circumstances where we might say, well, we don't want to be committing people of thought crime before they've even thought it.
Right. Yeah, and the flip side of that is designer babies, where if you have a bunch of eggs and you just know this egg is going to be a more intelligent baby than this egg, because we now know the genes that correlate with IQ, and you can just pick which egg is going to be fertilized. Right. Is it? I think a lot of people would have the intuition that it's cold and inhuman to choose the quote better egg.
Right.
But I don't have that intuition. I think if you know how many kids you're going to have and you just want to choose the highest quality eggs that you possess, I don't. So long as it was safe, I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah, you could build these financial armies of kids that you knew are going to be very successful and smart, and that's how you make your money in your retirement fund as an adult.
Right, but then people might worry that the rich will be able to take advantage of this technology, and
right,
the social stratification along the lines of intelligence, which someone like Charles Murray has worried about, will just get that much worse.
Right. What do you make of that whole Charles Murray situation, how Sam got tied up with that. Do you see any problem with pursuing any kind of race versus IQ study?
Well, I think this goes to the question we'll be dealing with in November, which is, can we get past race? If we can get past race, then there's really no reason to do the kind of research that was included in that one chapter of Charles Murray's book. So, for example, with IQ, we know that there's a reliable but small correlation between IQ and height, which is to say taller people have higher IQs than shorter people on the average. All the caveats apply. There will be a bunch of short people who are higher IQ than a bunch of tall people. But if you were to just divide the population into people above 5'10" and below 5'10", the average population in the average IQ in the taller population would be higher. We know that. That's uncontroversial to say. Where are all the articles and books about height and IQ? Right. There really aren't any, because we don't view height as a very interesting phenomenon. And I don't mean to sound glib here, but I fundamentally, I don't see why we shouldn't start seeing race more and more like that. Which is to say, the amount of melanin you have in your skin is not very interesting. It's very boring. So I understand why Charles Murray may have been moved to do this research at the time, because there's this massive orthodoxy on the left, which I have been criticizing, where you measure black people and white people by some mean statistic, you find a difference, and you immediately attribute that gap to racism, discrimination, whether it's overt or systemic. So I saw someone on Twitter recently call this the racism of the gaps argument, which is it's a play on the God of the gaps argument that many religious people poorly employ in arguments about whether God exists. Yeah. I'm going to start using that. I think it's very clever. Yeah. But you see my point here. I can see why Charles Murray may have wanted to do that kind of research to criticize the orthodoxy on the left of people who do similar kinds of research, grouping the races and finding discrimination there. But ultimately, I think both kinds of research, where you're just taking a group of people, drawing a circle around them, whether it's by ethnicity or religion, and finding differences and then talking about those differences. And I think that stuff should get less and less interesting over time. Yeah,
I think it will. I just see that, and I hope it doesn't go the other way, where we start valuing some races over other races from like I guess from an affirmative action position, or from I guess kind of like reverse supremacy of some kind, like we're like a supremacy of other races over other races. I don't think is ever a good idea. And I mean, this also begs the question, if we did find something that we could point at to say, oh, this race is greater at 90% of human activity than this other race. It's like, what do we do with that information?
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing to do with the information. Yeah. B, the question, I mean, the statement doesn't even make that much sense to begin with, because groups of people don't do things. Individuals do things, and then we analyze them at the group level because it's a convenient way of abstracting, because we just can't, it's just too cumbersome to talk about all 300 million people in the US. So we, with our limited brain power, we sort of analogize groups to individuals, and we talk about groups as if they were individuals, like black people are better at X, white people are better at X. But that's just a shorthand. What we're really saying is, among this group of individuals in which there is massive variation, the mean value is greater than this other group in which there is massive variation. And when you say it that way, it becomes much less interesting, because you just realize that you really can't predict almost anything about someone based on how they look. It's certainly not reliably. Right. So it's just part of it's just a confusion in the way we talk.
Yeah, language and labels get in the way all the time. So, is Trump a racist? I am told all the time that Trump is a racist, and I don't see any evidence of it, but maybe it's something I am overlooking.
This is a question that I'm actually undecided on, and I know, I mean, when people are asked if someone is a racist, I've noticed they rarely say I don't know.
Yeah.
They always seem very sure that it's yes or no.
Yeah.
And that's weird to me, because it just, he has said many things that would lead a reasonable person to suspect that he's racist, whether it's seeming to equivocate about Charlottesville, or making comments about Mexican immigrants and what kind of people they're bringing over. There are also ways of understanding those comments where they're just him kind of talking and saying the first thing that comes to mind without much content.
Right.
It often seems like he's almost not thoughtful enough to be a racist.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he could be. At the same time, he could be. So I'm pretty agnostic on the question, and frankly, I don't think it's that important of a question to answer.
Yeah, it's the reason why I bring it up is because I see this Trump is a racist being thrown around a lot online, and I guess when I see claims like this, if someone claims that their 10-headed God exists in the sky, my next question is, can I see the documentation or the evidence or the studies, peer-reviewed journals on that describe what this is? And then there's usually no evidence, or they'll forward you a photo of Trump when he had shaken hands with a racist in the past. And I mean, I guess I thought, even though I agree it's an uninteresting, maybe an unimportant question, just based on the type of person that Trump is, because it's hard to believe anything that he says, I think, or that he actually feels that way. But I thought it was interesting to get your perspective on that, at least to where you are at now.
Well, yeah, I guess the other reason I thought it's not so important to answer is because he's in the U.S. Political system. He's very constrained in what he can do. If he were a racist, he couldn't even act on it.
Yeah,
he couldn't make my life miserable as a black guy, even if he wanted to, in America.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the Constitution's going to protect against that. You'd think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk about the violence on the left. So what happened to lead us to this new wave of violence towards things like free speech coming from the extreme left wing?
What led to it? Probably a bundle of ideas coming from the academic left that have been around for a few decades, but seem to have really trickled into the young liberal consciousness at this moment, especially in the past 4 years, let's say. One of those ideas is intersectionality, the idea that our multiple identities along the axes of race, gender, religion, disability status, socioeconomic status, etc., that these are really fundamental pillars of our epistemology, in the sense that the particular identities that you happen to be that you happen to belong to inform what you're able to know about the world in a very important way, and that a conversation about any important issue in the world can't be had unless we first know what it is that you are, what boxes on the census that you check.
Right.
This is a very, very powerful idea. It's a very powerful idea. It's very intuitively satisfying. It's deeply emotionally satisfying for young kids, because think of what it gives you. Think of what it gives you if you're a young black woman, for example, it gives you immediate rights to essentially win arguments without having done the exact same level of research as someone you're talking to. If you're talking to, for example, a white man. This is like Obama a couple weeks ago at his South Africa speech said you can't dismiss someone's opinion if they're a white man. Yeah. And it's telling to me that the former president of the United States felt that it has come to that he has to say that at Nelson Mandela's centennial. But I agree with him that he has to say it, and I'm extremely glad that he did. But it's I think that's probably at the center of what has, because that there's no obvious place for free speech in that scheme, right? It's much like, why should I let you talk when you can't possibly know what I know as a black person? Right. Like, why? That's such an afterthought in this worldview.
Yeah. I get why people, if you're in an unfortunate circumstance of any kind, and an idea is given to you that helps lift you out of that, or gives you some kind of meaning or purpose as to why you're in that situation, and I guess maybe diverting away from reality a little bit. I can see why that would be a pleasurable pursuit for one to believe in something like that.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you say there is that it's kind of analogous to a religion. And I'm not the first person to point that out. Andrew Sullivan has written about that. John McWhorter has written about that. It is fairly analogous to a religion in the sense that it genuinely provides a deep well of meaning for young people who are looking for it and finding it there. We can't. That's a point that doesn't get said enough, which is, many people are quick to point out the bad parts of intersectionality and the various clusters the cluster of beliefs that form that make young kids so skeptical of free speech. And one thing that is forgotten is how much meaning they're getting out of it, how much genuine meaning. The meaning is real. Right. And that makes the ideas all the more dangerous in the same way that people doubt that jihadis are getting actual meaning out of their desire to impose a caliphate. Right. Like they're actually getting real meaning, and that is much of what drives this phenomenon. Yeah. Well, even
they're getting a lot of pleasure derived from that meaning, and I think that's what's ultimately driving all of this. What currently do you think is the biggest ideological threat to humanity? Is it something from the left, or is it still military war ways of thinking?
The biggest ideological threat to humanity? That's a very tough question. Actually, I don't know that I have a ready-made answer to that.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I've been thinking on this.
What do you think?
Well, I still think the ideas of religiosity and dogmatism, basically when applied in any sense, is bad for the mind. I think anti-science and unreasonable behavior are the two things I want to eradicate from this planet. So I think anti-scientific ways of thinking, those kinds of ideas, I think are highly dangerous to humanity.
I'm inclined to agree with you there.
Yeah, and I think having the kinds of discourse that don't fit into the TV model are really important, and I think this is adding to the fight against anti-science, and I see the world becoming a lot more secular, even though the fundamentalist voices will become I think louder as those religious fundamental ideas begin to die. But I think we're moving in the right direction in that regard.
Yeah, and I guess your question was, is it something coming from the left or the right? I'm not sure that I could choose, because there's quite a bit of anti-science coming from both. On the right, it's more on the climate science front, which I think probably doesn't get talked about enough. I'm sure it does get talked about, but I don't see people bemoaning this or working on it as much as I would like, because climate change is an extremely tricky issue, and even the solutions that seem to be on offer that are widely agreed upon by economists, like carbon pricing, the incentives for nations to actually implement them are so bad, because we could raise the price of carbon in the United States, and then countries that or companies that produce a lot of carbon will just produce that carbon elsewhere where it's cheaper. And getting every country in the world to do something at the same time, the incentives are all aligned against that, because there's really nothing in it for any given country. It's sort of like asking citizens of a nation to contribute a voluntary tax, with no threat of any violence from the state if they don't do it. Like there's a reason that you will get audited by the IRS when you don't pay your taxes, is because otherwise people would not pay taxes.
Right.
Because it's just like the contribution I'm making is so small, it's just a drop in the bucket, and there's nothing in it for me. It's a tragedy of the commons, and that's what climate change is. And it's really non-obvious how to fix that. And it really doesn't help that we have such this kind of right-wing machine of anti-science thinking and not trusting the quote deep state. Yeah. And then there's problems on the left too. Any branch of science that really intrudes into parts of human nature that are viewed as sacred, whether it's nature versus nurture, genetics, biological, vaccines, biological sex differences. All of these things, you get a lot of blowback on the left. And I'm inclined to agree with you that if there's one worst idea in the world, it's probably just, I guess it's a lack of an idea, really, because science, it's a mistrust of reason. It's not understanding scientific thinking. It's not understanding the benefit of testing hypotheses against reality. All of that is a disaster. Yeah,
it's kind of a lack of skeptical inquiry. It's kind of maybe a way to summarize it all. So what are you going to be working on in the future? What are your future career goals? Are you going to write a book, or what's coming up?
I'm not sure. I have 2 more years of undergrad, which I want to just focus on getting the most out of that I can. And we'll see what I do after. I could see myself continuing to write, continuing to speak, and I guess I'll cross that bridge when I come to it.
Yeah, great. And you've been doing some other work. I mentioned Colette. I wanted to mention them again. QUILLETE.com.
I think 2 T's. 2 T's.
Is it 2 T's? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Here. TTE. Yeah, so QUILLETTE. Yes. So you guys should definitely check out the Colette publication. It's a great resource for some really interesting articles. I wanted to jump to something that's really foreign to us up in Canada is the death penalty. Have you thought much on whether we should be applying a death penalty under any circumstances for criminals?
I haven't thought about it enough to have a strong opinion, but my instinct has always been no. I'm very much in the Sam Harris, Robert Sapolsky camp on free will. I don't think anyone chooses the mixture of causes that leads them to be who they are. And that holds just as much for Mother Teresa as it does for Ted Bundy.
Right.
I guess you'd have to show that in order to convince me that the death penalty was a wise practice, you'd have to show me that it was so good for society. It was so useful as a deterrent that it makes up for the fact that we're killing a person who we could otherwise just cage.
Right.
Yeah, I think bad people, we should aim to treat bad people like we treat rabid bears.
Right.
If bears can get rabies, I'm not even sure if that's possible, but in the sense that we cage a bear not because we think it's deeply responsible for the kind of bear it is. We cage it because we don't want it to maul anyone, and that's the effective way to do it. And if we had a pill that could do it better, we'd give it the pill.
Right.
I think the same holds true for violent criminals. And so far as I know, there isn't. I mean, do you know anything about evidence that the death penalty deters? Because the evidence I've seen is that what deters people is from committing crime is swift and reliable and fairly short sentences. Like after a certain length of sentence, you get diminishing returns where people just don't really take on board the risk of being thrown in jail for life. You hit diminishing returns after some number of years, and it would seem to me that the death penalty is like that. Criminals just consider it a kind of far off possibility that they don't actually factor into whether or not they're going to murder this person in front of them right now.
Exactly.
So that's my position.
Yeah, I don't. I've thought about this a lot. I think it's an important. I think the reason why I ask you this is because I think it's important for important thinkers and influential thinkers to be thinking on these kind of issues, because there are human lives at stake, and I think those issues should be more pressing for all of us to be discussing and talking about. It also. Yeah, and I agree on free will. Like I don't think we can escape. Our environments can be changed sometimes, which is forced by, someone else's free will interjecting. But it's like it doesn't matter what happens to us. We're not in. It seems like we're the last to know about what we're thinking, and it seems to be happening to us, and not us dictating what we're thinking.
Right.
Yeah. Anyways, I would love to chat with you again. I'm looking forward to New York, and I have to say, I think you are, one of the really important voices of the future, and that really excites me. It's important to have an articulate voice like yours eradicating anti-science and unreasonable behavior. I can only do so much from my end as a producer, but
oh no, Travis, you just called a black person articulate. They're gonna come after you.
Oh yeah. I'm ready.
So someone called me articulate at Columbia a few months back, and I took it as a compliment. And punchline, they were black.
Yeah, I guess the evidence would be on whoever's outraged by this. The evidence would be on. They would have to prove that I said articulate because it had anything to do with the color of your skin.
Yeah. Which
I've only seen pictures of you. I mean, you could be an Asian woman for all I know, but you seem to be a man. So
for the time being,
yeah.
I could be an Asian woman by the time I see you, but I plan to remain a black man.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
Today I'm speaking with Sargon of Akkad, a.k.a. Carl Benjamin. Carl has a very popular YouTube channel where he devotes his time to dismantling ideological nonsense. Thanks for coming on, Carl.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's how are things over on your side of the world?
Um, Honestly, things are going strangely, very, very strangely.
How so?
Um, the the way that politics and philosophy are affecting British life at the moment are quite tangible, and nobody really seems to be addressing the issues in the way they need to be addressed. So,
What there seems to be something. What is going on with Sharia law in the UK right now?
yeah, it's worrisome. There are de facto areas of Sharia law in Britain because Britain has always, I suppose I would say England really is. This is a consequence of the English, but they've always been a very decentralized people, I think is the best way to put it. This is where I've been doing a huge amount of research in the past few months because I'm tired of hearing the phrase, "Well, what are British values really?" Because it's one of those things where it's like asking a fish what water is. You know it when you see it. You're always in it, and yet as soon as someone tells you to, asks you, go on, identify it, everyone suddenly freezes up and goes, "Well, I don't know. It's just what's around us. Look, you can see it. It's very hard to quantify usually." And so I thought, right, okay, I'm actually going to go through this, and I think it all really comes down to the concept of accountability. And I mean, if I had to describe the British and the Continentals in one word, the British would be common and the Continentals would be elite. And that's very much the distinctive philosophical schism I see between English and continental philosophy. And this translates to the entire Anglosphere, obviously.
Right.
And you can see the result of this in the Brexit referendum, because by and large it was just England voting to leave Europe. Most of the Celtic areas voted sort of 2-1 to stay. Not that there weren't Brexiteers in the Celtic areas, obviously, but the majority. Whereas in England, it was mostly England that voted to leave. And I really do think this comes down to a kind of philosophical schism that there's really, I mean, it's been present for hundreds of years, I think. Like probably going right back to Runnymede. I mean, I realize that I'm talking like it sounds vague, but it's hard to describe because you're trying to describe like the general character of a nation in the way that they conceive of the world, just the worldview of the people. And I know it sounds silly, but like in England, we had the signing of the Magna Carta at Runnymede, where the Baron sat the King down, King John, and said, "You will not treat us arbitrarily. We have rights. You will respect those rights. Your power rests on us being obedient to that power. And so we're going to have accountability." And really, it goes back further than that, back to the Anglo-Saxon Witan, which was a council of noblemen. But you can trace this going forward to like the 1688. It was 1688. I think it was 1688. English Bill of Rights. And I mean, that's 100 years before the French got their Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Men, was it Men and Citizens or something like that? And you can see the early development of accountability and decentralized power in England compared to on the continent. I mean, and I think the difference really does come down to the fact that the citizenry was armed. The Englishman was required by law to practice his longbow every Sunday, and there were various points where kings outlawed football because men would rather go and play football than practice their archery. Whereas on the continent, French peasants weren't allowed to carry weapons. And I think that's really created a kind of a difference in mindset. So when you had Louis XIV saying, "I am the state," and becoming an absolute monarch in France, when Charles I tried to do the same thing, it triggered a civil war, and it got him beheaded, and it cemented the supremacy of Parliament, the representatives of the people, in England. And from this, I think, is the entire schism between the Anglosphere and continental Europe. And so this is why almost all of the philosophies that come out of continental Europe, any kind of gradient of them, are a lot more collectivist, a lot more elitist, sort of stemming from Rousseau's the general will that creates a kind of justification to do things on the assumption that there are people who fit the characterization that you are using. For example, when a socialist says, "Well, you're an enemy of the people," well, who are the people exactly? Well, the people are the people I represent, and the discrete group of workers, the industrial proletariat. But I mean, you might be shooting one of the proletariat in the back of the head for being an enemy of the revolution. This sort of thing doesn't happen from English philosophy, and I think it's because it's individualist, obviously.
Right.
And I think that the core reason that there is this difference is the kind of common nature of English life, because ultimately it all comes down to sort of like a sort of local, homely accountability. Whereas in the continent, it's more elite and glorious, frankly. That one of the things I've noticed about, but when researching into this, is it's hard to find glory in England. It's really hard to find glory. Whereas the French and the Germans are saturated in it, And I'll stop.
Why is that? Well, no, it's interesting. Why is it hard to find glory in England? Just because of the reasons you just spoke of?
Well, that's not a fair thing, but like it's not that it's hard to find glory. There's lots of glory in English history, but there's lots of glory in almost everyone's history. It's about the glorification of this glory. There's something about it that sounds. I don't even know how to describe this properly, but it sounds kind of tinny to the British ear. Whereas in Germany and in France, it doesn't look that way from the outside. I might be wrong. I might be misinterpreting them. I might be treating them unfairly there. I wouldn't want to. I'm not trying to condemn anyone, but it seems that there's a majesty that's built up that's not consciously, but it is deliberately separated from the commoners. And in English history, it's not. I mean, obviously, whenever you're reading the history of kings and queens and princes and dukes, there is a huge amount of that, but it's. I don't know. It's about the way the philosophy kind of evolved, and I think it comes down to the fact that the English had their Bill of Rights so early. I mean, like I think it was in the 14th century, there was a law passed where the agents of the king couldn't force their way into a free man's house. If he shut the door, then the agents of the king weren't allowed to force their way in.
Wow.
That's unprecedented.
Yeah.
Imagine that in feudal China. It's an incredible innovation in civil rights, and so I don't know. I'm still exploring this train of thought. But
you seem pretty baffled by this because it is baffling, right?
Even I am. I mean, like it's this kind of arrogance that the common Englishman had. That's what it comes across as. This boundless confidence and arrogance in, well, why should I not get the same treatment as the king?
Right.
It's almost ridiculous in a way, and yet it's kind of endearing to me.
Right.
I find it cute.
Interesting. So going back to this Sharia law epidemic, I guess, is it becoming politically correct for Sharia law to be considered an acceptable branch of law right now? Or is this a very, very, I would hope not, but.
No, I think so the way that this is being treated in the UK, you've got a few problems. The first is, as soon as you try and address Sharia law, someone with a very weak knowledge of postmodernism will jump in and say, "Oh, well, what is Sharia law anyway? I mean, which school of jurisprudence are you talking about? How can you even identify what Sharia law is?" And they will, and it's the same way they try and attack the concept of British values or any of these other assertions that you make. They try their best to deconstruct it. I mean, and usually it's quite effective because usually the person is not really very au fait with what Sharia law actually is. They're taking it on faith from the people who are claiming to be representing Sharia law, and so they can't give you a detailed breakdown of what school of jurisprudence that they're using and what the exact rules of those schools are, and so what the difference is. But I mean, the problem with them saying, well, what is it really? I mean, if you're going to deconstruct the idea of Sharia law, how do you justify the idea of a Sharia court? Right. And yet we still have about 100 of these operating in the UK. So there must be something called Sharia law, and they must require a Sharia. Sorry, they call it a council and not a court because it doesn't have any actual legal standing.
Right.
But it does have de facto standing. And when you've got very close-knit, conservative, highly religious communities that really are not well integrated into the local population and actively, push away outsiders, these become, like I said, de facto, and they may as well have all of the force of law backed by the state, even though they're not. And there's a great reluctance in British public life at the moment to address the fact that these even exist. Most people, and getting back to the sort of localism of English life, usually people are free to associate in any way they want. And so when you present a Sharia court, it's very easy to present it in the English mold of, well, this is all about free association. These people decided that they wanted a Sharia council, and they will present themselves for arbitration because it's part of their Islamic faith. Who are you to judge? So, well, that's true, except there's compulsion involved. There's an awful lot of compulsion involved. If not the actual physical compulsion of, say, husbands forcing wives, the compulsion of mass censure from their own communities. So we can't pretend that these courts are being freely used. And then you get into the plight of ex-Muslims in Muslim communities being forced to by the fellow people in the communities to engage in these courts, and honestly being persecuted by people if they admit they're an ex-Muslim. So they're not being approved of, but they're not being dealt with. And we would not be the first state in Europe to ban Sharia courts anyway, if we did. And I find it very uncomfortable to have a two-tier legal system. And then people say, well, what about the Jewish courts? I'm like, well, I'd be happy to ban them too, frankly. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So what's the reason why they're not getting on this and banning them? Is this PC?
Oh, political correctness. Yeah. Without a doubt. I mean, people outside of Britain don't seem to understand the depth by which political correctness has infected the public life in this country. The fear of being called a racist or a xenophobe or an Islamophobe, any variant of that term, has absolutely crippled the police departments in some ways and the judiciary in some ways.
Well, these terms are being thrown around so often, it's amazing that they hold any weight anymore at all.
You would think that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But for some reason, people are still afraid of losing their jobs. They're still afraid of losing their friends. And honestly, you could find yourself committing a hate crime, and you could actually go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we don't have free speech in this country, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I was just going to jump into free speech. So a lot of people always are confused with what the dangers are of losing the ability to exercise your free speech. I mean, to me, this is simple. It's fundamental in being a critically thinking human being. And what are the dangers in losing your ability to exercise this?
Well, You're exactly right. You can't be a critical thinker if you don't have the ability to freely express yourself. Because if you have an idea that you can't express, you can't develop that idea by speaking to someone else and getting their opinion on it, and adding that to your own and gradually forming an informed worldview. So you become myopic and anti-intellectual. But more importantly, I think, is the fundamental necessity of free speech to a liberal democracy. Because, and this is something that it goes right back to the very roots of liberal political theory. If we agree that violence does not a civil society make, then we agree that the state has to be invested with the monopoly on force. There has to be. So we can live our lives in peace. So we don't fight with each other. So we don't need feudal laws. This is the whole point. And if you say there are certain things you cannot talk about, if you restrict people's speech on certain subjects, then what you are doing is saying that these subjects will never become a public problem. If these subjects do become a public problem, and you still prevent people from speaking on them, then the only recourse people who have a problem with these subjects have is violence.
Right. Because
they can't be solved with debate, dialogue, a cultural change, and then a change in the laws, which is normally how a problem is solved within a democracy. And this is why the parliamentary system doesn't tend towards revolution. If in a country where you have free speech, You can change the culture by simply speaking about your problems, and culture influences the laws that are made. The laws that are made then tend to reflect the culture, and it becomes a cycle, sort of an evolutionary Darwinian cycle, rather than what becomes instead a Hegelian cycle, where you get the thesis that represses its antithesis, and eventually they come into violent conflict. I don't think that's a good idea. I prefer the Darwinian model, and I think that this is what free speech does. It allows problems to actually be addressed before they become problems that are insurmountable and can only be solved with violence.
Yeah. So talking a bit more about PC culture, there's been this explosion of PC culture in the West, and it has affected a lot of things, including feminism. I mean, I still want to label myself as a feminist, but I find myself not being able to do that anymore because feminism is increasingly being turned into this just this disgusting, nasty attack on, or I guess committing sexisms and racisms. Are you a feminist from a traditional standpoint, as in you believe in equal rights for females, but you don't subscribe to all the nuanced bullshit, or where are you at with feminism?
Well, I mean, I would never describe myself as a feminist because of what's happened to feminism. Before I studied any of this, I probably would have described myself as a second wave feminist. You know, I would have. I mean, I'm a liberal, you know, so I'm an individualist. I'm for individual rights. So I think that there are human rights. I don't believe that there are group rights. So if humans can vote, if humans can get married, if humans can do these things, adult humans can do these things, then I don't see why any group should be restricted from that on an arbitrary basis, on the fact that they're a woman or they're gay or something like that. You would have to show me demonstrable harm that could be done. I mean, you know, this is why I don't want children voting. You know, demonstrably a child isn't educated enough to make a political decision,
right?
So I don't think a child should vote. But you would have to give me a good reason to restrict that kind of right for these people, and I can't see a good reason. If women can work and they pay taxes and they can serve in the armed forces and they can serve in state, I mean, for me, there's no argument why they shouldn't enjoy the same rights as everyone else. So I've always viewed the world that way, and I assumed that that's what feminism was,
right?
But it's not. It's not anymore. Feminism, honestly, feminism really has only been conquered in the recent past by intersectionality,
right? Which
is, as Jordan Peterson accurately describes it, and I think he takes this from Stephen Hicks, who I've interviewed, and he's absolutely right on this. I think it's a deliberate form of deconstructionism to fall back on a certain kind of Marxist moral philosophy, and it really does. And when Jordan Peterson says something like the postmodernist, the Marxist lie of white privilege, he's correct. The entire worldview is dichotomized between oppressor and oppressed. And as a liberal, I just don't have that worldview. That's a Marxist worldview. I don't agree that everyone is being oppressed by someone else, or every class, is being oppressed by another class at all times. I right. just don't agree. And I don't agree that this, and every premise that comes from this, you have a moral duty and a right to hate your oppressor. Do you want to be hateful? Do you want to find yourself imbued with this kind of hatred? But if you walk into this kind of mentality, you don't have a choice. You'll end up that way. So yeah, I wouldn't call myself a feminist because of what feminism has become. But I'm definitely a women's rights advocate. But I'm also a men's rights advocate. I'm a human rights advocate.
Yes, same with me. And I think it's just much more constructive to deal with these problems of abuse or harassment or, you know, this perceived prejudice on an individual basis.
Oh, absolutely.
I just don't like this idea of grouping people together and saying that this has happened to them because they happen to be this colored skin. It's like, well, I mean, let's take a look at the individuals and see if they have been affected by this, and if they have, let's hold those who have affected them negatively responsible if necessary, if the offense is worth pursuing.
Well, it naturally leads to collective punishment and collective guilt. if you are to do exactly what they ask for. And this is manifested in every single way in intersectionality. Check your privilege. You can say that to any white person, no matter how underprivileged they are, and it can be said by any non-white person, no matter how overprivileged they are. And it's just a universal, you are white, therefore, or I am non-white, therefore. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrible.
So when you're talking on issues of feminism or on issues of race, how do you react to people who say, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about because you are a white male?
Generally I laugh because it's not an argument. That doesn't disprove anything that I've said.
But this is fundamentally a racism and a sexism combined into one.
I think that's absolutely a racist and sexist angle of attack. But that's only because I have a different definition of racism and sexism to them.
Right. And then, you replace this with shut up, you don't know what you're talking about because you are a black woman. It's like, what would people think of me if I was to say something like that?
What would I think of myself?
What would I think of myself if I said that to someone? But, it's amazing that some very intelligent people that I've met over the years, that I've worked with, that I've had at my speaking events, just talking with some of them backstage and just at dinner and things like that when there's not too many people around, oh, that's just my white maleism showing. And saying this kind of stuff, and this is coming from very, very highly intelligent people, highly influential people, and it's like, no, this is not right. This is something that's not being thought about in the right way. There's so much to be gained from virtue signaling, and I think it's become this addiction. I just see people addicted to it. Their pleasure drive for that, being admired by this very loud PC crowd of saying, yes, you said what we wanted you to say. I want to cheer you. I want to buy your book or whatever. It's just, it makes me sick.
Well, who doesn't crave approval? Yeah. And this is approval on demand.
Yeah.
All you have to do is say the right thing, attack the right person, and, be perceived to be in defense of the right victim. And you'll gain adulation, tens of thousands of retweets. I mean, there's a big market for this.
Right.
It's got a lot of currency, being a stalwart defender of victims.
I was going to ask you, can you think of any, maybe in the past, let's say 3 or 5 years, of ideas that you held pretty dearly to your heart that your mind's been changed on? Yeah,
the idea that equality is a good thing.
Sorry, did you say quality?
Equality, yeah.
Equality. Oh, okay. Yeah. Why don't you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah. So the word equality is very interesting because normally you think in a sort of English-speaking liberal democracy, when people say equality, most people think equality of opportunity, and what they really mean when they say that is equality under the law. They want blind justice. They want equal rights as citizens. So they think that they deserve, voting rights, the right to run for office if they want, the right to be treated without distinction under the law by the state, and without distinction or favor, apart from anything that they've actually personally done, which is where the opportunity comes in. And that's exactly what I want, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to want. But the word equality doesn't just mean that. And that I think could be more accurately termed equity. Because equity means fairness. And I think that is fair. Whereas when you say equality, you can also, this is how the Marxists effectively infiltrate into liberal spaces. They're saying, well, we're here for equality. And everyone's like, well, yeah, I want everyone to be treated equal. But you don't want everyone to be treated equal. And if you spend any time thinking about what the Marxists are actually saying when they say that, you would probably recoil in horror. The idea that an artificial equality of outcome has to be managed by these meddling busybody types is the reason I think that there is so much pushback towards social justice. It's obviously an anti-freedom movement. I think it was Solzhenitsyn who said, you can have freedom or you can have equality. You can't have both. And he's correct, because people are different. And we have to take that into account. There's no getting around it. Everyone's a unique individual with their own strengths and weaknesses, and the idea of trying to equalize these out is honestly quite a terrifying idea. And what's the story with the handicapper general in it? I can't remember the name of the story. It was a short story about what a future where state mandated equality. I mean, it was a satirical story, but like what it would look like, and people, if you were too intelligent, you'd have to have earbuds in that constantly had a ringing noise, so it made it hard for you to think. Because ultimately, equality really is the lowest common denominator. Equality, a material equality of outcome. It can only be the lowest common denominator, because anyone who's not at the very bottom will not be equal to the people who are at the bottom. So you've got to drag everyone down. And I mean, there was a great meme that went around about this. It was a beautifully overgrown garden. Is that, where you've got massive trees and bushes and plants and flowers, and it's gorgeous, and this is liberalism, and then you have socialism next to it. And it's just a mown field of grass, just every blade level.
Right.
And it's it was a really great way of conceiving, because that's when they say equality, that's what they mean. And this is why they keep harping on about the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap is just, there should be a gender pay gap. Not because women deserve less, but because they earn less. Women do less hours in the office than men. If you think that women could end up with the same amount of money at the end of that, then you must think that women deserve to be paid more than men per hour. Right. There's just no squaring that circle.
Yeah.
But the constant harping on about equality, it makes the men guilty of working hard. And honestly, it's kind of a way of reverse shaming the women for not working hard enough.
Yes.
I'm speaking as a really lazy guy. I hate working. I respect the female decision there and not going into work. I would do the same. I think these guys who spend all their days in the office are wasting their time. They should get out and enjoy life more.
Right.
But yeah, that's the key thing I think that's really flipped in my thinking.
Yeah. So equal opportunity versus equal outcome being the. I think everyone should have the opportunity to earn as much as someone else, but they need to bring, if they want to up themselves to that level, they need to bring, the same level of education or all the other tools that the other person's bringing to the job. And this is outside of your gender, outside of your race. This is like, as a business owner myself, I can't imagine someone that would ever apply the thinking, I think I need a woman in here next, so I'm only going to look at women's resumes, or I think I need a black person in here, or a Chinese person, because statistically they happen to be stronger at math than white people. It's like, this crap doesn't come into my mind.
Isn't that just racial stereotyping in and of itself?
It is, it's hard for me to even bring myself to a level of understanding of what people think people are doing in those situations, because it's a concept I find hard to even grasp, let alone how I would even put that into practicality. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, I just want to kind of defend the idea of hiring, say, a black person or a woman on their own sex.
Sure.
There are definitely times where you will need someone who is black. I mean, for example, if you wanted to make a movie about Shaka Zulu, you're going to need to hire a black actor to play Shaka. If you want to make a movie about Cleopatra, you're going to have to hire a woman to play Cleopatra. Otherwise, it's going to look strange. It's going to break the immersion of the experience.
Yeah, I guess if you're going for realism, right? I could think of instances like I've seen reverse race versions of Othello, say, and I found the concept interesting. I found it interesting from an entertainment aspect and I guess from a pleasurable perspective, but I get what you mean. It's like, if you're trying to depict reality, then why not?
It's not that there's never a need for it, but generally most jobs don't really have much in the way that's tied to your race and gender. I mean, and maybe there are some jobs that it is beneficial to be a man in or a woman in or whatever, but the idea that diversity for diversity's sake it always worries me, because, and I hate the way they use the term multicultural as well. This is such a diverse, multicultural workplace we have. And then you realize that they all think the same, but they're different races.
Yeah.
Because what they're saying is that culture is directly tied to race.
Yeah.
And that's the argument of the Nazis online.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Trevor Noah did this with the French in the World Cup. And, you know, he's like, well, you don't get a suntan like that in the south of France. It's like, Trevor,
yeah,
that's what Richard Spencer's argument was.
No kidding. Yeah.
Would you please stop? They let them be French. If they've lived their whole lives in France, they've grown up in that cultural milieu. They identify as French. They don't know anything about Africa. Don't sit there calling them African, because you're making it sound like the racists have a point.
Right.
You fools.
Yeah. Let's talk Trump for a bit, if you don't mind. What do you think? What do you think of this whole thing that's happened in the U.S. with Trump? Like, it just every time I turn on any kind of media outlet that's covering this, I still can't fucking believe like what I'm seeing. I mean, I'm one of the very few people in my circle of people I know that guaranteed a Trump victory, just because I feel like you got to hit rock bottom as a country, and this was a good way to do it, just from a purely intellectual point of view. But what's your take on this whole thing?
I started supporting Bernie, actually, and then Bernie demonstrated to me that he was weak. That was my problem with Bernie, because I'm concerned about the power of identity politics in our societies. I think it's far too high, and watching Bernie get humbled by identitarians was too much for me to bear. I couldn't take it.
Right.
And I found him sort of lapsing into this when he said, white people don't know what it's like to be poor. I was just like, right.
Yeah, that was a horrible mistake.
Yeah. And I think it was Philadelphia. He did a rally and two Black Lives Matter activists shoved him off his own stage. And I was just like, right now, I can't accept that at all.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really pro-Trump at the time. I was certainly never Hillary. No, certainly. And then later on we learned that Hillary Clinton, by foul means, prevented Bernie from getting anywhere. She had pipped him at the post by using corruption. And it was like, okay, well, I'm certainly very much a never Hillary now. And with Hillary, the amount of institutional force that aligned behind her on both the left and the right was genuinely worrying to see. I don't think there should be this kind of alignment of power in a democracy. I think it was too much. And I'm very glad that she lost, purely because Trump was such an underdog. No one thought he was going to win.
Yeah. And
everyone hated him, and they laughed at him. He was a fool. And now he's the president of the United States. So there's a part of me that really enjoyed that.
It's very Shakespearean.
Exactly.
It's pure Shakespeare. The whole outcome. The fool who was dancing in the background becomes king.
Yes, that's
really
a great way of putting it, and it's very interesting from that point of view. And honestly, I think he's actually doing a remarkably good job.
What are some of the victories and what are some of the major failures that could you outline of Trump's presidency so far?
Okay, so the major failures, I think honestly he needs to. I mean, how would I phrase it? I don't know if I'd describe it as a failure, but I think one of the major thorns in his side that he can't get rid of are the people who are now suffering from what's colloquially known as Trump derangement syndrome. He has. I mean, I've never seen. I've followed American politics for about a decade, and I've never seen the kind of vitriol that Trump receives. I mean, they just irrationally hate the man to the point where they're openly revolutionary. You've got Maxine Waters saying we need to harass those people in public, and literally using the word harass. And it's like, wow, you know, these people are A, not equipped for a revolution, and B, they're unhinged, absolutely unhinged by this defeat. He needs to somehow reconcile with these people, but I can't imagine how they will ever do it. I'm not sure there's anything he potentially could even say that would convince them that maybe they could come to the table with him. Because I think at this point they're demanding his head on a pike. effectively. They want him gone by any means necessary.
Do you see any justification for the outrage? Like he does a fair amount of, I guess it's trolling,
yes,
and it's easy. And I mean the far left is so easy to troll and to trigger.
Yes, they are.
And it's
yes,
I mean he is dialed into that, and
he has.
And the comedic response, the laughter gained from those who are kind of centrist right, I feel like that wins some of them over just by the pure comedy of that.
Honestly, that's how he won me over. I was a centre lefty, and he definitely won me over because okay. So my problem with the left, really, I came out of the left. I always consider myself just a left winger. I still support universal healthcare. I still think that social safety net is a necessary thing in a democracy, in a meritocracy. So I still consider myself to be a centre-left individualist liberal. But the problem with the left at the moment is it's been completely taken over by collectivists. These people who are big believers in group rights and unique group experiences, and this sort of thing, and intersectional socialists, effectively. Yeah. And they're terrible. They're really awful people. And sorry, there's a train going by in the background. I've got to leave the window. They're really. I think the way I would describe them is moral authoritarians. If you don't agree with their moral prescriptions, then you are fair game. You are fair to publicly humiliate. You are fair to get fired. You are fair to ostracize. You are fair to bully. You are fair game if you don't agree with their moral standards. Right. And because of the natural sort of virtue signaling potential of this, they tend towards purity spiralings, and the level of moral virtue required is constantly being ratcheted up. And right. So inevitably more and more people fall outside of this. And it's an oppressive force. And it's difficult to resist unless you know how to resist it. And most people don't. Most people, when they're being accused by a progressive mob on Twitter, they naturally go, oh, well, I'm really sorry. I wasn't trying to offend people. Right. But they don't realize that their capitulation is their submission.
Right.
Because now they've agreed to all the premises on which they're being accused, and they're never going to forgive them. Because normally when you apologize, forgiveness comes afterwards. The person you apologize to, like if we're having a one-on-one conversation and I offend you, you say I'm offended. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. Okay, no worries. You've apologized. You let it go. It doesn't matter. But not with the virtue signaling progressive mob. This becomes one thing just on your record, your moral record, that becomes part of your public persona, and this will never be let go. And so Donald Trump just inverted this and just pushed. He just said, I don't care. And it's the only way to deal with this. Because if you're not going to be forgiven after you apologized, never apologize. You can't apologize to that person, because the only reason they would extract an apology from you is to make you subservient to them, to make you submissive, to gain control over you. And Donald Trump simply refused to be controlled. And I think that's the most powerful force in politics in the West at the moment.
And do you feel like you were pushed out of the left by the left, or was it more you were attracted to some of the ideas that Trump had, or that the right possess?
Oh, I was virtually physically ejected from the left.
Right.
When I started objecting to identity politics. I said, yeah, but I'm a liberal. And they were like, well, that's a right-wing position. Oh, really? Liberalism is right-wing now. Okay.
Interesting.
I suppose it can be, but I mean, it depends on what you think's acceptable. But no, I mean, Donald Trump's really not very ideological. He's not really very much of a sort of mold breaker in many ways, philosophically.
No, yeah.
Honestly, he's not that smart, but he's got a good gut instinct, and that's what he plays on. And honestly, a lot of his success, I think, has come from that. But I mean, really, if you said to Donald Trump, right, Donald, I'm for individual rights, how do you feel? He'd be like, yeah, okay. I'm for democracy. He'd be like, yeah, okay. He's not gonna question any of these sort of classical liberal precepts. So it's not so much his ideas that I'm attracted to with Donald Trump. It's the fact that he's basically prepared to be a moral wrecking ball to this giant glass house that they've built that needs to come tumbling down so we can actually have a dialogue and stop political correctness stifling us all.
Yeah, I see PC culture infecting some of the, like I was saying, some of the most reasonable minds I've ever had the opportunity to speak with. I see it infecting even the best minds, and I don't like it. And I don't see Trump as a great president for the simple fact that I like someone who has kind of a conscience that's always working, always processing, and not too, kind of gunslinger. Like I see Trump as very much like kind of a gunslinger, and then the obviously the right or the far right see him as this gunslinging hero, but I kind of see him as this very unpredictable force that I don't think he could ever say, despite what many on the left would say, I don't think he could ever say the wrong thing that's going to start a nuclear war. Like, nuclear wars don't happen that way. I think that this is a false. It's just not. It's not something to be worried about. But are there? Would it be better if Donald was more intelligent and he could? He was more philosophical about how he went about things? I think so, because I think you can be that and also be what he is doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to suggest that being more intelligent would be a bad idea for the president of the US. But I completely agree with you that he's not going to start a nuclear war, and via Twitter. It's not going to happen. Yeah. And honestly, I think people are growing used to the fact that he mouths off. And the thing is, he's had a long history of a larger-than-life public persona. Everyone knew what Donald Trump was like. Yeah. He was famous, for crying out loud.
Well, they got what they voted for. Like, they got literally the man who they voted for is still the same man today. Like, absolutely. I don't think he has changed whatsoever, even despite maybe learning, he is that same force that was voted for. So kind of you get what you pay for.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, in many regards, he's doing a great job. I mean, your economy's doing fantastic at the moment, even with him entering into this trade wars. And he's bringing the EU to heel. He'll probably end up bringing China to heel. He's done this. He's done great in North Korea. They've actually started sending back remains. They're actually holding up their end of the bargain. There's no way Obama would have got something like that, because I think people need to remember that when you're dealing with dictators or regimes that don't value human rights, you can't talk to them as if they are a democracy. Like there are so many people like, well, why don't you shame that person for his record on human rights? Because he doesn't care.
That would be a very bad dealing strategy, to go in there and start pissing on the guy for stuff he's done.
You're not flattering or pandering to his ego.
Yeah.
But B, it's not an issue he can be shamed on. Yeah. But threatening him with destruction, that's something he's very, very cognizant of.
Yeah.
And something that he can, he knows. And suddenly he's making friends with South Korea. And the South Koreans were saying, well, this happened because of Donald Trump. And I think that's true. I think it's completely true. That's a major win for Trump. De-escalating tensions with North Korea is fantastic. And the Russia thing recently, the left has got such a poor conception of how international diplomacy works, in my opinion. Like, the idea that they thought that Donald Trump could stand on a stage with Putin and say anything other than, no, of course I don't think he did it, is absurd. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It doesn't matter whether Donald Trump believes he did it or not. I mean, I'm sure that Trump believes Russia was trying to do something, and I'm sure that Russia knows that they were trying to do something. Just, excuse me. Just in the same way that the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Paraguay, I'm sure, every nation is engaged in cyber warfare and intel gathering and things like this. Every nation does this. The idea that Donald Trump could stand on the stage with Putin and repudiate him on that score is absurd. It would require Donald Trump to undermine his very presidency to be able to repudiate Putin on that stage. There was just no other alternative for him to say, no, of course he didn't do it. We're friends now. We're going to have good relations with Russia. Right. And really, there's no particular reason that the United States shouldn't have good relations with Russia. The ideological Cold War is over. The Russians are no longer communists. I mean, if you went back like 100 years before the before the Russian Revolution, science fiction authors assumed they would write, like future histories of the world, and science fiction authors like the Last and First Men by I can't remember the author now. He was a Norwegian author, I think, but Olaf Stapledon. He wrote like a future history of the world, and because of it's something like 1900 it was written, and because the expectation was that Russia would become capitalist, that the Americans would essentially finance Russian industry's development, and the Russia would be pulled into the American orbit. Didn't happen because of the Communist Revolution, of course, but that's there's no reason that Russia and America shouldn't be great trading partners. And the first step towards that is normalizing relations with Putin, and that requires Trump and Putin to have a personal relationship. Right. Why would they think that he's going to get up on the stage and wag his finger about internal domestic American politics? And when Putin was asked about this, he just said, well, this is just internal American politics and I don't care about it. And that's exactly the right response for him to give.
Right.
It's the American left and the establishment have become pathological in their obsession about this. No one else cares. No one else cares about Russia.
And any of these successes that you think Trump has had, do you think Hillary could have made these as well?
She wouldn't have done these things. I think I honestly think we would be at war already if Hillary had managed to win. I think she would have overthrown Assad. I think she would have destabilized the Middle East even further. I think ISIS would still be doing their worst. I think that I think we would have had much more open confrontations with Russia. I mean, we've killed like 100 Russian soldiers, in the Middle East already. But I think that we would have had much more open confrontation with Russia. I dread to think, frankly, Hillary Clinton. I mean, on a personal level, I find her repugnant, but there's no doubting that she's brilliant.
Right.
Unbelievably well informed. We saw from her WikiLeaks emails. I read like loads of them. Unbelievably well informed. I mean, she knew that the Saudis were funding ISIS, and she said nothing. She had all the information. It was in her emails, and yet she did nothing. She carried it on because she was playing the great game. She's Machiavellian in the most strict sense of the word, and she was part of the globalist elite. Donald Trump is a nationalist. He's the complete opposite ideologically.
Right. So I thought we would finish with, I just got back from Dublin and London. We did 2 massive large-scale events up there.
I was at the London one.
Oh, you were? Oh, okay. Interesting. What did you think?
I was kind of disappointed, actually. I did a video review of it. I don't know. I enjoyed the back and forth, but honestly, I'm an atheist and I've never been religious, so I'm not really interested in the question of God.
Right.
For me, it's interesting and abstract if that's what you're into, but there were far more important, pressing, contemporary problems Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, and Sam Harris, thinkers who I have nothing but phenomenal respect for. I adore each of these guys for different reasons in different contexts, and I was excited to have them on the stage. And I thought, okay, well they've had like an hour of talking about God. Okay, at least we'll get to the Q&A. And then they skipped the Q&A. I was, oh God, So by the end of it, I was frustrated more than anything else.
Right.
It seemed like a missed opportunity to me.
Yeah, when I think about the God issue. The reason why I like to put so much time into it is because we still have people hacking at children's genitals because of what they believe a God has told them to do. Sure. And when I wake up in the morning and I feel and I think about how I want to affect the world, I usually think about children's safety first, and I do think there's a trickle down effect from this intellectual discourse into parents' minds when they eventually get access to this content or they're watching. So I think shaking one's belief in God is a great thing, and I think Jordan Peterson's forcing a lot of fundamentalist religious minds to actually start thinking about, well, maybe I need to move from fundamentalism to this metaphorical approach.
Sure, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of what they're doing. speaking very much from a personal perspective there.
Right.
I'm not saying there wasn't import.
Yeah.
But I think there are also, I mean, one of the reasons, that, in my opinion, that things like genital mutilation still exist in the West is because of the permissiveness of the politically correct establishment. It's such a strange phenomenon that in the West we look at the most extreme examples of religiosity from foreign cultures and assume that they are the norm, assume that they have to be catered to. Even though, I mean, if you went to any one of these countries, like Saudi Arabia has cameras in every mosque. Why do they do that?
Yeah.
To prevent jihadi radicalization, obviously. We don't do that in this country. Well, why not? Well, it might offend the jihadi radicals.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, let them be offended, you know. But and there are loads of examples in Middle Eastern countries where it's actually the moderates that are actually in the driving seat in that regard, and they're actually relegating the extremists to the fringe and are actually policing them. And we don't do that in this. I mean, like the abaya, the full, or the burqa, whichever one it is, the full body dress with the little letterbox eye slit.
Yes.
That's not legal in many Islamic countries. You're not allowed to wear that.
Right.
And yet we are in the streets of London and Bradford constantly. We are providing a breeding ground for fundamentalist, highly conservative, theocratic right-wing Muslims. And this is not acceptable in many of their own countries, but we do it because we think that's what being tolerant is. And what we're doing is setting the stage for these people to be able to oppress people who are more moderate in their own communities. Because it's always the loudest and angriest and most fundamental that, if left unchecked, gain access to these things. Because these are the people who are the meddling busybodies of their society. I mean, I was trying to explain this to... I read a book by a professor who spent 2 years in Saudi Arabia. And he was very in favor of Islamic culture. And he found it very strange the way the people acted there. And coming away from it, it sounded very much like if you took an Islamic form of a social justice warrior and then gave them a country to run, it would look like Saudi Arabia. And so most Muslims probably don't want that. In the same way that most people probably don't want to live under the oppressive thumb of political correctness. And yet, because of political correctness, we indulge the most extreme and conservative versions of their religions as if they are normal. And this is, in my opinion, one of the reasons why genital mutilation is still happening, and it's happening in the West more than ever, because we're afraid to deal with it as if this is permissible over there.
Interesting. Well, Carl, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it, man. Everyone, it's Sargon of Akkad. If you're not following his YouTube channel, you really need to. I'm sure most of you are. I'd love to chat with you again sometime, Carl, for sure.
You've got me on Skype. Just give me a shout anytime.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in.
So today I am so lucky to have on the podcast Ari. And I don't want to butcher your last name because I definitely will, trying to pronounce it.
Just go ahead, try. See if you can do it.
Okay. Let's see if I can even find the Hershkowitz.
Hershkowitz, yeah.
Hershkowitz.
Yeah.
Okay. Ari Hershkowitz. And just to give you a bit of a background of what we're going to be talking today. First of all, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'm visiting Vancouver because we have an event tonight with Matt Dillahunty and Douglas Murray.
I look forward to attending that.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. Are you familiar with Matt Dillahunty?
I've met him a couple months ago here in New York.
Great. That must have been for the Sam Harris event?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were here for that event?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, what did you think?
I heard some new ideas that I hadn't heard before and some new ways of thinking. And I like that a lot.
Great. So One of Us is a 2017 documentary featuring a film that chronicles the lives of 3 ex-Hasidic, is that right?
Hasidic.
Hasidic Jews from Brooklyn. The film was directed by those who brought us Jesus Camp, which I'm sure all of our listeners are familiar with. That was the movie with the psychotic, batshit crazy lady. What is her name? Her name escapes me right now, but those of you who saw the movie documentary Jesus Camp will know what I'm talking about. And that's so the creators Heidi Ewing and Rachel Grady created this new documentary, One of Us. And I have to say, I was very affected by the documentary. I finished watching it last night, and this just further fuels my charge and want to get out there and more quickly eradicate so much of the anti-science that causes so much pain and abuse to people.
Right.
And
without harming the people who are practicing that, because they're the ones who are affected by it most.
Exactly. And you know, it's so easy when we hear stories of even sexual abuse coming from the pulpit or from, you know, your community or ex-community. It's so easy to go to anger and want to strike those people down and go after them. But I do feel a sense of, you know, I feel sorry for people who were indoctrinated into belief systems that didn't really set them up very well.
Right.
And you know, just like you, like, I wanted to go back kind of as far as we can go in your history, and just kind of move through step by step and see if we can identify some of the key points of reflection in your life. And obviously at some points you'll have been much too young. But I thought we should start with, so you're born onto the gurney, and are you genitally mutilated?
That's the first question. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
I am circumcised.
And what's your just generally, what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you feel like, is this a big issue for you, or is it something you've reconciled?
Well, I never really was not circumcised, so I don't really know what if it would be a difference for me. But in general, there's some people claiming science on both ends, if it's better for, you know, in terms of health or not and whatever. I can't say anything about that because I'm not a doctor. I'll leave that up to the actual professionals. But the way it's done, I have a lot to say about. And without being too graphic, it's not being done in a hospital by a doctor in a sterilized environment.
So feel free to be graphic. How is it being done? Like,
can your viewers handle it?
Yeah, you bet.
All right, so I'll make it as short as possible. Most of the foreskin is cut off. The rest is bitten off, and then some of the blood is sucked out with the mouth by someone called a mohel, which is it's someone who's done it a lot but has no license for it. I think that like, without going to the whole ceremony, which is traditional, I'm totally okay with. Just that part, doing that to an 8-day-old kid is.
So it starts,
or to anyone.
Yeah, right. So it starts with the cutting, or the snipping, and then it moves to the biting.
I'm not sure which one is first, the biting or the sucking out the blood, but
right.
Both of those happen.
And when you reflect on that now, obviously, like, your views of that, have your views of that ritual, I guess I would call it. Can you point to a time or remember when you were thinking about that and you thought, yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me?
And I don't think it ever made sense to me, but I remember defending it. When I think it was Mayor Bloomberg who tried to ban that particular practice. And there was a whole storm and they managed to win it. I don't know if it was in the courts or PR, whatever it was, they won and they can continue doing it. That's when, well, just growing up, I only had access to the local newspapers, Hasidic ones, and only Hasidic music, and basically everything was in-house. Like everything was you only heard what we wanted you to hear. So all I read was those papers, and they explained it that it's like this attack on God and this attack on Judaism that they want to. It's not about the actual practice. The reason they want to ban it, it's against God and Judaism. So I remember hearing some defenses for it, but I don't know. It's also something we don't really talk about. Like the kids don't really talk about it. And when I was an adult, I was halfway out.
Yeah. I mean, kids have a hard time dealing with hard situations anyways. It's the wiring isn't quite there yet, and trying to understand something as brutal and graphic as that is just, and it really, I mean, it really is a testament, these type of things, biting an 8-day-old's penis. And
it's for God though, so you can't really say that it's wrong because that's what God wants, and
right.
God is never wrong. So,
and this is a problem so when people always ask me, they say, well, what's the danger of believing in God? And then I always ask them to define God, and typically I would say probably, man, it has to be 98% of the time, this God they're describing would be an all-knowing God and the absolute authority on morality. So the problem is that when we have this imaginary being, and the fact that human beings can hallucinate and use that imagination further in this fantasy, one day during, mild psychosis, they might hear a message from God to go and chop off the head of their neighbor. And the way God puts it in their imagination is that, you have to do this because this person needs to be with me in heaven, and you can get them there. So please go and carry this out, and you will have done God's will.
Yeah, that I think probably has happened before over the course of history.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And a lot of killings have been done in the name of God, but even without the hypotheticals that keep on happening, I mean, just look at what, just circumcision, like we just talked about, just that, and ostracism and so many other things that are happening in the name of God. So yeah, just believing in God can be very dangerous. I agree.
Yeah. So things weren't off to a good start for you, even at day 8.
Yeah. No.
This is not the way to start a child into the world, and I mean, this is demonstrable. You were bringing up some. You mentioned that it's kind of there are some, scientific facts on either side of the equation as far as what's healthiest and what's not when it comes to circumcision. And this is a myth I'm trying to extinguish, in that any reputable scientist of any kind that has looked into the circumcision issue will see that 80% of the world is uncut for males. And this doesn't lead to more disease or more issues when it comes to cleanliness or or anything like that. It's it actually, in the West for a while, it seemed like kind of the norm for a doctor to say, circumcision or not, to parents, and they would say, well, one way. The doctor would even give the advice, well, one way or another, it doesn't really matter, and then the parents would, make their decision, and thinking that they were making a morally sound decision either way. So it's in the West, a lot of parents made the decision to circumcise their children in what I call this state of being in a immoral pleasure drift, in that they drifted into the immoral, but they were led there by bad advice from doctors, because they were convinced probably as well that it wasn't a big deal and it wasn't this huge ritual of abuse.
Right. And does Christianity say something about circumcision?
Yeah, I mean, from my understanding with Christianity is that when it comes to circumcision, is that there is this covenant with God. So I'm not sure that circumcision is this major thing in New Testament belief, but I think in any kind of Christian sect that still holds the Old Testament true to heart, then I think they would believe in that covenant of cutting. But this all started, we go back as far as the Egyptian dynasty. I don't even know if that's the right word to describe them. But it started as a fashion trend in priests. And that's a pretty I don't know what it was about the Egyptians, but they like cutting shit off their body and doing shit to their body. It's kind of crazy. But maybe they were just bored, not enough PlayStations and Xboxes around.
They didn't have fidget spinners.
Yes, that's the thing. Like if they had fidget spinners, we wouldn't have this like brutally evolved, strange thing of essentially putting your mouth on a baby's dick when they're born and sucking the blood. It's I have endless amounts of media that come in through all of my social media networks, and a lot of the time I'm sent these videos of this ritual being performed, and it is one of those things that it's just so obviously immoral. But again, it's what God would want.
Right. It's not on us to question that.
Right. And is there like a particular doctrine that outlines that this is the right way to perform this circumcision?
I don't think so. I think the way how to do it exactly developed over time. I'm not sure exactly where it's written. I never studied it, because
right.
When I actually did study Judaic studies, I was not an adult. But by now they know exactly how they're going to do it and so on. But I'm not sure where it's coming from. I think it evolved. But I think it was very smart of those people who wrote the New Testament to leave that out. I think that would turn away some people. That's how they nitpick what they like. Like circumcision, I don't think people will be so up to that. So we're just going to skip that, and God doesn't want that anymore. God changed. God had a change of heart.
Yeah, that's when you read some books and you're just like, it's like out of nowhere there's a death scene or this insane rape scene in like a children's story or something that would maybe be deemed appropriate for children. It's just like, you have to be, if you are going to take the Old Testament into consideration when forming your whatever worldview, you have to edit that book.
Yeah.
Exodus 21 sanctions slavery. It tells you how long you can or how much you can beat a slave. It gives you the
difference between a Jewish slave and a non-Jewish slave also.
Right, exactly. And it gives you these crystal clear guidelines on which to follow if you're going to keep a slave. And this isn't abolished at all in the New Testament by Jesus. Jesus says in the New Testament that he's here to fulfill the laws of the prophets, and not a he says a tittle or a wink or something like that of the old law will be abolished. So, I mean, it gets full endorsement by Jesus, and then this introduction of eternal torture comes into play.
Yeah, and slavery is totally cool, right? God is okay with that. But you can't eat bacon.
Yeah.
That's a big no. That would be very, very bad. You can totally have a slave. You can beat him up to a certain point, but you can't have no shrimp either.
Mm-hmm.
Very important to remember.
Yeah, and so did you so let's move to, say, your early teens. What was it like being in your early teens, kind of coming into puberty and like that whole aspect of living in a very sheltered environment?
It's tough being a teenager, even more so when you can't look up online certain things that you're afraid to ask your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think a lot of people had. The internet is not that old yet, but I didn't have really who to ask anything. So I was a troubled kid, as they call it. Always the odd one out. I'm not blaming my leaving or the community or becoming an atheist. I'm not blaming the bullying or anything for that. That was a realization, but it was my teenage years were definitely an eye opener for me, and I guess it got me to ask some questions that otherwise I wouldn't have asked, because you can't ask those, and just wait till you die and you can ask God.
Right. And as you were going through those stages, if you had a question about, let's just say, for example, if you had a question to your parents about masturbation, would you have been able to talk to them about that, or was this a term that wasn't even in your vocabulary?
Well, it wasn't that term. I think they I'm not sure what did they call it? I guess the Hebrew version of wasting seed or something.
Oh, okay.
But no, I could never ask them anything about that. I'm not supposed to. It's just a no. There's no leeway. There's no question here. It's just no. We did hear a lot from our teachers and principals in school about what would happen if we do masturbate. I don't remember which religious book it's from. I'll find it and send you a copy of that particular part. It was something like the devil will hang one by their penis and barbecue them. That's it's very specific. What's waiting for me up there or down there.
There's so much directed towards the penis.
What is it with God and the penis?
Well, I mean, it's obviously this, the net amount of pleasure you can get out of your penis is probably why there's so much, focus on it through these doctrines.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. It's God. That's where God put her focus at.
Yeah.
It's also the feet, I think. I was in Oklahoma for the American Atheist Convention.
Right.
And Faisal Sidamatar was there, and we talked about this. Every religion has something to say about feet. How you tie your shoes, which is in Judaism, which foot goes through the door first, I think in Islam, and just very important things, which leg to wash first. And we came to the realization that God has a foot fetish.
Yeah, I mean, it's all the evidence points towards that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
it's okay. It's 2018.
Yeah.
It's totally okay. It's just there's no reason to hide it anymore, because
No.
that just causes more pain and suffering.
no, God might as well step out of the closet and just come out and tell us what his fetishes are. And I mean, from all the gods I've read, he seems to have a fetish with human blood and sacrifice, and he likes all that stuff too, or she.
What kind of movies was God watching as a young kid? I'm wondering.
Exactly.
And did God have access to video games?
I think they would still. I think if the God character still, if he was to come out right now, they would still blame the Matrix for all of his downfalls. The movie.
Oh.
When all these, when the Columbine shooting happened, when a lot of these school shootings, the religious community was always pointing towards the pop culture things as the causing factors towards these shootings, rather than looking within their own system and seeing what kind of monsters mentally they were creating in these communities by oppressing, so many just natural things about what it means to be human.
I think that doesn't contradict itself. It could be both movies, video games, and religious indoctrination. The way that would work is that God watched a lot of these horror movies as a child and played a lot of these video games, and then now it really is the word of God. But you have to go back and see, where did God develop that sort of thing?
Right. Yeah, so if you believe in a omnipotent God, he's essentially played every video game, watched every movie, even if those things haven't occurred yet in time as we recognize it. He already knows what those things are and all the details, because he created it. So, God is highly influenced by arts and culture.
Yeah. So...
Yeah, and again,
so it's really a sad story.
Yeah.
Just a young child God being turned in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And it's just sad.
Yeah.
Rather than anger provoking.
Yeah, it's the story of, all the other gods that had their shit together and were able to create create universes where there wasn't brain cancer in children. There was this kind of, I guess, a reject God where they kind of pushed him aside and bullied him, and that God was like, I'll show you. And then he created this universe with all this death and suffering and a very small amount of life in one little tiny corner of the cosmos. And I'm gonna experiment with some really weird shit, and all of it's gonna have to do with dicks. Yeah, and that'll show you, and you're gonna do weird things to penises. So now we should talk about abuse. What is your, when you reflect back on the abuse you've incurred, what is the most hurtful thing about all of that?
The response after I asked for help. I completely understand that something like that will happen in every community. Psychopaths do exist, and I don't think any law or anything is ever going to stop that. There's always going to be psychopaths. But what I think is changeable and hasn't changed yet, they've started to do some change, but there's a long way of improvement ahead, hopefully. What could be changed is the sane adults changing the response to what happens when a kid comes home and is very confused and says something happened, I'm not really sure what it is, and what's going on, is crying at night, and what do you say to that kid? Do you get them a therapist and tell them it's not their fault, or do you say, I don't think that happened? That doesn't make sense because that rabbi, that teacher is a very honorable guy, so don't make up stories like that.
Right.
So
yeah, that's just brutal. And I think, one thing that this idea that one Jew can't hand another Jew to authorities, that seems to be the poison at the center of not wanting to deal with the huge rigmarole that will come out of, outing another Jew to the authorities.
Yeah.
So you're asking, you've told someone about this abuse, the reaction is that way. What is the next possible step for you to, do you just close this? Do you just close these experiences away and not deal with them, like all of us do with trauma, or do you just, are there other anchors that you relied on to deal with this?
Well, besides the bottling it up and forgetting about it, and also one way I dealt with it was trying to go a little outside of the community and see what else is out there, asking questions from people. It's really what got me to ask questions, because how can this ever happen, right? Another thing was self-harm, and it helped, but of course did a lot more damage in the long run. But yeah, that's how I dealt with it. But mostly it was just bottling it up, and there were a couple incidences, and not all of them I told my parents and teachers, but after a few times being shut down and clearly seeing that they think I'm lying, even though there was one instance in which my dad kind of not really saw it, but was pretty clear. He was sure about what happened. It happened in the basement of a shul where we prayed every Saturday, and without going into too many details, my dad was looking for me after the prayers. I came up from the basement, and it was clear that something had happened, and this guy was walking right behind me. And my dad's a smart guy. He got the picture, and he even yelled at the guy, and in a way, like hinting that, like, I know what you did, but past that, no, I didn't get a therapist, or I honestly don't know what happened to that guy. I'm not aware of anything, like of any charges pressed or anything like that.
So how did you find yourself down in the basement with this person?
I'll make the story short, because it brings back flashbacks. But I was playing with his son, and he came over and said that it was either I broke his son's belt or it was my belt that hit his son,
right? And
he had to take that away from me. And that was like the start of it. So,
wow.
And my father wasn't there, and I was a little kid. How can I really argue against that?
Yeah. And your father, while this is going on, is upstairs
praying.
Oh man.
I'm sure that some people who were in the shul that day will remember how my father yelled at that guy. But that's as far as it went. And in all honesty, when I was that age, I didn't even realize what had happened, other than WTF. Like, what is this guy up to?
Right.
And so I needed a therapist for myself more than that guy being yelled at.
Yeah.
I also, now that I'm an adult, I would have loved to look back and see that guy's been in prison for 8 years now, or 9 years now. That would have been nice.
Yeah. And do you have these? Do you still have some passion in wanting to pursue any kind of legal action towards those that have wronged you and abused you?
Yes, but I'm also a very realistic person, and I know what happens to people.
Right.
when they try to pursue such a thing, and I know that it's a tiny percentage of a chance that I'll ever get any of them, bring them to justice. So I'm a realistic person. I'm working another angle.
Yeah.
That I'll when it's ready and they can't stop me,
Right.
they'll know about it. But I am working another angle. Not a like taking justice into my own hands. It's more, bringing it out to the public type of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important, and I will, I want to support you in doing that, and you can lean on me as far as any kind of support you need,
Thank you.
legally or whatever to do whatever you need to do, because, I just can't say enough, like, how tragic, like, even just that one, episode with you in the basement and your father upstairs. It's just that whole, how something like that can happen to a kid is just, I look at, various different worldviews around the planet, and I don't see that. If you're following a true kind of humanist approach to the world, I don't think there is room for things like that to happen. And
right.
I just think modes of psychosis in a humanistic worldview, they don't take you down to the genitals. Right. I think there is a connection between religions having this obsession with what you do with your genitals and putting all this focus on the genitals through different rituals and different teachings about sex, and I just think there's this thing about religions that really boils up, pedophilia and pedophilic tendencies, and I just urge people to not let their religious beliefs take them down a road where all of a sudden you're doing things that you feel are wrong, but you're doing them anyway in order to please some kind of imaginary being. It's like that moral system that comes out and stands in contradiction in your mind to what this teaching or doctrine is telling you to do. This is a good tool that's evolved in us. Our ability to reason these situations. So that's my note on that.
I guess if God ever tells you to do anything, get a second opinion, because just looking at what God has done, I mean, if you believe, of course, just according to your beliefs, what God has done. Well, I don't think any of your listeners are believers, but if there are any, probably some people from the community will listen to this.
Mm-hmm.
If your God ever tells you anything, get a second opinion, because don't think God knows what they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I would point at is I mean, so many God believers believe that they have the one true God and all the other gods were fake.
Of course.
But I would apply, hopefully you can at least apply this same amount of requirements for evidence to all gods across the board, and you'll see that in a metaphoric sense, like people like Jordan Peterson would talk about, your God may be true in a metaphoric sense, but that's not the kind of truth we talk about when we're talking about existence of gods.
Right.
This is so please just apply that same burden of proof to all the gods equally, and then you'll see that yours doesn't exist more than any other gods or Santa Clauses or leprechauns.
The flying spaghetti monster, however, does exist.
Yeah, in a metaphoric sense, the flying spaghetti monster does exist, and that's the real fucked up thing about believing in a metaphoric God and following these crazy doctrines is that, okay, you realize that sure, we've created this metaphoric truth realm that, okay, anything can exist if you call existence that, but that doesn't justify what if you commit these horrible actions in the reality that we're all experiencing. It's not going to justify if you point at this metaphoric truth thing and say, well, I did it for that. It just, if that thing actually existed and you had good reasons to carry out these actions, then you might actually be reasonably justified in doing these things. But you can't be reasonably justified in performing these weird rituals for an imaginary God. It just is, it doesn't make any sense. And Pascal's wager doesn't even apply if the God doesn't exist. So,
and it's not just what they do in the name of that mythical notion. It's they put that as a priority before so many other things that should have been a priority, like friends, family, moral values, the right thing, like, for example, you can't hand in another Jew to the authorities, but when that Jew did something really bad, well, you should have done something about it, but, well, it's not what God would want. So you're putting the myth before an actual thing that just happened that needs processing.
Yeah. Do you still have a relationship with your father?
Yeah, it's decent.
Yeah.
It's not where I want it to be, but it's a lot better than most of my friends have it. So I'm not complaining.
Have you ever talked to him about that instance?
Once.
Yeah.
And I've actually never shared this before.
Right.
So exclusive. In rehab, which, by the way, I just want to say, like, my parents were really, really helpful in getting me out of addiction, and I have roughly a year and 6 weeks about. I'll have to look it up. Clean of all substances now, and
congrats.
Thank you. It's their credit in a big part. So when my parents came to visit me in rehab, well, I never really shared the details of those incidences, but I did share it with my therapist after I got sunburned, and the nurse looked at my back and saw these scars, and the nurse said, you have to stop scratching your back. I know it's itching, it's a sunburn, but you have to stop. I said, that's an old thing. Don't worry about that. She took a picture, showed it to my therapist, and my therapist just said, call me into her office and said, you're not leaving this room until I know what those scars are. Long story short, not long later, we had family weekend or whatever it was, and my parents were there. One of the tech staff took my mom for a tour of the facility because she wouldn't be able to handle that. And I told my dad in details everything. And he gave a very vague, well, it's not like we can do anything about it now. So, he was like, let's move out. Let's move on to the stuff we had to discuss that was on the agenda, because that's not something we can. What can we possibly do now?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not blaming him though.
Yeah,
I'm blaming the indoctrination that he got.
Yes, I understand, and I mean, I think it's okay to be angry at that virus that infects those who have been indoctrinated to say something so cold-blooded and insensitive. I mean, the obvious thing to do, I mean, in your situation that you're explaining, it seems like you essentially have a partial eyewitness to what occurred. And I mean, it's like, why wouldn't the response be to, to go after this person and to get some justice for you? That's my reaction to that is let's build a case and go after them. That's the way I feel. Like, I want to take arms up with you and fight the moral fight and hopefully gain a moral victory. And I understand that from your father's perspective. It's like, I assume he's still tied in with the community.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like he's doing the one Jew can't hand another Jew to the authorities, and that is trumping his ability to act morally.
Yeah. So, like I said, it's putting God before friends, family, and moral values, and all of those important things, which I would put it as a priority. You can have God in your life, meaning I would have God in my life if it was a nice game. You go and pray, as long as you know that it's not actually something, and it's a game, like a video game or something else.
It's culture.
As long as it's culture and tradition. And of course you don't put it before the important stuff.
Yeah. So
if your God interferes with moral values, then maybe your God's got a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, every God I've read has some serious problems, and they happen to coincide with the problems that the ancient people who supposedly found these scriptures, or they were divinely inspired, they seem to have the same problems understanding simple moral values as the gods of that time.
And you can see how that changes over time. Like the New Testament, like not saying as much about, or not saying anything at all, I'm not sure, about circumcision. Because by then some people grew up and they saw that, okay, maybe that's not what God would want. So let's just go ahead and give that up. Quick, give me the whiteout. Let's just fix that up quickly. And
how are we going to sell this to people who can think a little better than the people?
It was like a business deal. We have to meet in the middle on the percentages here in order for both of us to go out of this happy.
Yeah, and funnily enough, we have this explosion of slavery in the West. Even after things like the Old Testament are kind of reformed, we still have these severely immoral situations that happen even when the religions have tried to evolve.
Because the religions evolved and like grew stronger. Evolved in a different way, besides evolving into a more approachable, smiley way.
Right.
It also evolved into becoming a lot bigger and bigger over time.
Yeah.
And you can clearly see a correlation. I mean, religion has killed. I'm not sure if that's true. I have heard this, and maybe you've studied this. Religion has killed more people than all the wars combined. Like all of recorded religious killings and all the recorded war killings. I'm not sure if that's true.
Yeah.
But it kind of makes sense because for a lot of, there were periods in time where, okay, so Islam now kills Christians, and then Christians kill Islam, and Jews, Muslims and Jews. And kind of makes sense.
Yeah. It's interesting to think, like the Pangburn philosophy is let art and science inspire. I think in order to live the most fruitful life that one could live, you need to have a solid foundation in science and art. And I wonder if that philosophy was kind of adopted by early man. I wonder if this would have resulted in, rather than religious wars, if it would have been more like, Da Vinci creates this amazing piece of art, and there's a war over whose art is best. Like, would we have resulted to the same level of brutality and barbarism if there wouldn't have been religion and we were more fighting over whose painting was best.
Right. I don't think at a sip and paint one Friday night you can. I don't think that has ever turned into a 10 million people killed. I don't think so.
Yeah, and
we could have had the atomic bomb a lot sooner, though.
Yeah,
but we also would have had electricity, and we would have had a lot of other things sooner.
Yeah, we waste, and I talk about this all the time, so I'm a bit of a broken record. But we waste so much of our intellectual real estate, which I think we have a limited amount of that. But we waste so much of it on anti-scientific pursuits with our mind and just believing and giving money and resources to bullshit, and we do so much of that with our resources. It's unbelievable how much money we waste on just bogus ideas. Whereas in the scientific community, the bogus ideas are weeded out very quickly.
Yeah.
Because we actually rely on evidence to show us
there's a step one,
what
step
in fact
two.
Is going on.
There's a step one, step two. Step one, can you prove it? Step two, does it make sense? You go through a list of things and
the reason why it's such a it's a perfect system is because it actually benefits from the people who want to quote unquote destroy your model. They want to falsify. They want to prove your model wrong. And that's essentially what we're trying to do when someone brings a hypothesis forward. We're trying to prove that hypothesis wrong, and then in the end, the equation makes sense, and we can't prove it wrong, and it's adopted as the best acting model that's based on the evidence of reality.
And the good thing about this is, if new information comes along,
yeah,
we're not afraid to say, okay, well, we were wrong and we got some new information. Yeah. Unlike, I saw someone wrote once, like, the difference between a priest and a scientist. What would get a scientist to believe in God? Evidence. What would get a priest to not believe in God? Nothing.
Yeah.
Even with evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously it gets into this strange realm of we always have to make sure we understand who has the burden of proof when it comes to, proving what they're saying, and it's a very amateur.
Million times, you can't prove God doesn't exist.
Yeah, a very amateur approach to any conversation like that is when you say, "Oh, can you prove that the God that you just claimed actually exists?" And then they'll say you can't prove that it doesn't exist. Well, like I say all the time, if you're holding on to some kind of belief, apply what you're saying across the board. You have to apply it to Santa Claus. You have to apply it to leprechauns. You have to apply it to the flying spaghetti monster. You have to apply it to any metaphor that I can think up. And this is why we created logic and we created reason and science, so that we could weed out the bullshit from the real stuff.
Right.
It's just so that we're not walking around just thinking that a gargoyle is going to fly down from the sky and rip our head off. Like the likeliness of that happening, regardless of what your imagination is telling you, the likeliness of that happening is essentially zero.
Believing in something has never and can never actually change reality. So just because you strongly believe in it and you actually feel it, and God really helps you find parking, it still doesn't change the reality. And a good way of countering you can't prove it doesn't exist is, I think I saw that on Reddit, is Mike the magic God-eating penguin. Have you heard of Mike?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Mike is a magic God-eating penguin, and anytime a god exists, Mike automatically eats that god. By definition, because Mike is the magic God-eating penguin. So even if your God does exist, he's been eaten by Mike. So either you can prove that Mike doesn't exist, and either you can prove that Mike doesn't exist, and Mike already ate your God, because if you can't disprove it, then it exists, or you can prove that Mike doesn't exist, and the same proof applies to your God.
Man, there's got to be T-shirts with the penguin eating God. I like it. I like it. Yeah, it's crazy how we're still struggling, finding our way through these religious
One
texts.
quick thing that I wanted to add: if any animal was gonna eat a cat, it's gonna be the penguin, because they have wings but they can't fly. It's just such a tease.
It is.
And it's like, if it's on anyone to eat a cat, it would totally be the penguin.
Yeah, the penguin. What other male praying mantises have it pretty bad too. I think the female, they don't start eating. So right after the male, I think it's as the male is impregnating the female, she starts to eat his head. Or something. It's something really. I'm gonna have to. I'll add that as a point to the next podcast to actually get the information together. But there's something fucked up about right after the male impregnates the female, she like eats him as a snack, and then
not in a good way.
No. Yeah, it's not like, oh, eat me, baby. It's no fucking eating them, like biting the foreskin off of a baby's dick. I know that's a horrible, horrible thing to relate that to, but it's, sometimes we have to make light and humor out of some of these situations that are just impossible to comprehend, at least from my worldview. There's some in the documentary, I should mention, there's some major abuse that occurs to remind me what the woman who's in the film,
Ati.
Yeah, Ati, her, and she's got 7 children, right?
Yeah.
7 children, and she's in this relationship where she's being forced to have mandatory sex.
Yeah, Friday night
mandatory sex, that is just like
it's straight up rape. Let's call it what it is. That makes
me sick to think that, like, and this isn't the same as, how a couple who they might just not be finding time to have sex, and they set a date to say, okay, let's put in the effort and try to have sex.
Let's put it on the calendar for Friday night.
Let's put it on the calendar for Friday night, and we're going to do our best, to work towards that, and we're going to save some energy. We're going to buy some Red Bull, and then we're going to, bump it out. But, no, this is a society that's 100% dictated by what the man wants, right?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that, without going very specific into Ati's story, because I'll let her speak for herself, and I don't want to get anything wrong. But just in general, in the community, the females are second class. Like, my mother is somewhere in her 40s and does not have a driver's license. If she were to get a driver's license, my siblings would get kicked out of school.
They would get kicked out of school? Wow.
Yes. So Saudi Arabia has female drivers, and Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York does not. Yeah. In the Hasidic community, of course, is what I'm talking about. No, it's not a legal thing, but...
So do you think in your research of cultures or, different religions around the world, is Hasidic Jew culture the most archaic?
I'm not sure what that word means. Okay.
Oh, the most
English
like
is not
ancient,
my first language.
Yeah, like the most ancient in practice. Like, do you think because it's like Do you think it's less with modern times than any other belief system that you've come across?
I'm not sure. I know that Islam has some. I know we're not supposed to say anything bad about Islam, but I know that Islam. I've spoken to some ex-Muslims, some of my friends, and they have some pretty messed up things. So I can't compare it, but I think it's the general religion thing that is that ancient, has never grown up part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I look when I'm looking at some of the ancient cultures that are still around, kind of the older they get, the least amount of women's rights there are. It seems like there's that correlation, and that the closer we move to an evolved religion that's changed over time, we start seeing more freedom for women.
Because if religion, the whole thing about the religion is to never change anything because that's what God would want, your values and all of those things, you take them from 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. You can't change anything in your life. If your life is like 3,000 years ago, then yeah, then you don't think women's rights is something important.
Yeah, and I mean, funnily enough, in the societies where women are kind of most free, I mean, religion's essentially dead.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that, like, you know, free of indoctrination. There's still, you know, in the United States, there's still a significant amount of God-believing Christians. But, you know, these are all people who've been indoctrinated into this religion. I don't see Christianity in the West, or any other religion for that matter, really bringing in a lot of new blood outside of the people that they've indoctrinated from a young age.
Right.
And I think this is a great sign, because naturally a lot of those new kids who are being born into, you know, our modern culture, luckily we have things like the internet that are going to inform them on what is actually going on this planet. But, you know, like how you had to grow up, you didn't have access to the internet for the longest time.
Yeah, I got in the internet a lot later than everyone else.
Yeah. So what was that like? What were the things you wanted to look at right away?
Anything that I like seen anywhere, like simple things, like, you know, I keep saying the same thing when people ask me this question, like Elvis and tacos, you know, things that everybody knows about.
Yeah.
So I wasn't looking up complicated things. I just wanted to know really what are tacos because I see an ad for that.
Yeah. So you didn't run to the computer and feverishly write out tits or ass or
no
porn. I feel like that would have been maybe
had I had internet a couple of years before, maybe that's what would have happened.
Yeah, definitely.
I did have not access. I wasn't given access. I took access to a computer in someone's office that I used to print out Wikipedia pages, and I would bring that to yeshiva, which is the religious school where we, by the way, learn nothing of value other than Judaic studies, which is, it's my focus right now and what I'm trying to work on. So yeah, I printed out Wikipedia pages and had like a red marker, like a highlighter with me, and anything that I didn't understand I wanted to look up, I marked that and then went back, searched that, tried to find out what it means, and printed out those pages, and that's where I got my education from.
Yeah, and I mean, you obviously, like, there was no talk of evolutionary theory.
Oh no, I googled. I mean, I searched there on Wikipedia. I have the Big Bang Theory, like all of those things that I looked up, and it was mind blown that some people actually try to make sense of this instead of having this one 3-character word that is a one-size-fits-all answer for any question that ever existed.
Yeah, I can't even comprehend what that would have been like to be kind of locked away from reality and from science in that way. It just must have been like the world was black and white until you kind of came out to kind of see what was really going on.
Yeah, and it was mind blowing. It was. I can't even like. You saw how excited I was to talk about Wikipedia, and like some people, like most people, they grow up with it and they know about it, and it's like not a big deal. Yeah, I'll just look it up on Wikipedia. For me, when I found it, it was so amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's this extreme like wealth of information that's exactly what I was looking for forever.
Right.
And that was really exciting.
Yeah. So you seem like you have this natural need to pursue what there is to know about reality.
Yeah, I'm a very rational, logical person.
Right. So do you think that helped you out of this religious indoctrination?
In terms of leaving physically or in my head?
I would say both.
Well, in my head, really, it started with questioning and first asking the people around me, because they're supposed to have all the answers, and they didn't have much. Got yelled at for asking questions. Some people were like, I don't know, but ask the main rabbi, like ask the grand rabbi, like basically sending it higher above, and basically no one had a clear answer. And some people were just like, we don't ask that questions. We just do, and that didn't sound right with me.
Right.
Like, you should do because, you have a reason to, not because God.
When you're looking for a long explanation, you just sustain the in God.
For as long as you want it. That's why it's a one-size-fits-all answer for anything. In terms of physically, like getting out and leaving, also my it's not realism. What is it? Like my rational thinking got me through it. So I really started at GameStop to get internet access, because some of these computers they had there.
Right.
That was quite a few years ago, but the computers they had there, to play games, they had a browser, and I was just there all day. So it started with trying to figure out a way. Well, they don't let me have internet access, so what can I do? And just going around it until I eventually got a phone, and then there was a long couple of years of me having a phone, my father searching my room and my pockets and taking it away, and then just basically going in circles with that.
Yeah. Did you suffer any kind of physical abuse outside of the sexual abuse stuff growing up? Like, is it typical for parents to kind of beat their children if they're insubordinate? Well,
yes and no. So beating their children, personally, I didn't have any of that. My parents are very loving and very, very good people. Unfortunately, they've been indoctrinated, but as human beings, they're lovely people. So I didn't get a lot of that. The little of that I did get, I totally deserved. I was a pretty messed up fella as a young kid. So I'm not blaming them for ever doing that.
So why you've mentioned a few times.
But in school though, in school though, it was pretty bad, and I think now it's gotten a lot better in the schools with that. But I think it was a lot worse before I started going to schools there. But when I was there, there was still no exactly like don't hit kids.
Right. Yeah. So what I was going to say is that you've a few times have said that you were a messed up kid. Just there you said that, you were deserving of, some abuse or some, discipline.
Discipline, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think hitting is at all the right thing, but I just think that, like a lot of parents, even in any community, they didn't see another way, I guess.
Right.
It was pretty bad, but it was never horrible, and I think that's because my parents are lovely people,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure what's going on in other families. Just
Yeah.
personally, my parents are
Yeah.
as great as someone who's indoctrinated can get.
Right. So why? So what makes you say that you were a troubled, essentially a fucked up kid? What makes you say that you were troubled?
I was bullied a lot, and I had severe anger issues. They were extremely bad.
How did those show their face? Your anger issues?
Me hitting other kids.
Yeah.
Pretty bad. Usually just causing trouble in school also. Just like it's a Hasidic thing, I think, because I don't think it happens anywhere else, but just lighting like a plate with anything on fire in the staircase in school and walking away. That was not just me. That's kind of it was an often occurrence when
in an all boys school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just happens, and people, it's kind of like they're used to it. They know how to deal with that by now. But it was also a mental illness that was a few things. I was misdiagnosed with bipolar, and I was in the wrong meds for 6 years, and at the same time not being treated for the right things.
For 6 years.
Yeah, I was in the wrong meds for 6 years.
That's a long time to be on the wrong medication.
Well, there was a few years of trials and different things, and then 6 years of the wrong medication. Yeah.
Wow.
It was only until I started getting second opinions that changed, and a doctor told me, actually, no, you were never bipolar in the first place.
Wow.
And the other mental illnesses that were not treated and even unintentionally made worse. Like, I have misophonia, which is a sound-related disorder. Without going too much into details, certain sounds just trigger me into an instant rage.
Oh, okay.
You're 3 feet away. I can't hit you without getting up. Don't worry about it.
There's actually an invisible barrier here.
We have a plexiglass here.
No, I'll try not to make one of those sounds.
And I don't think they have an explanation for why it happens or any cure or treatment, and it just happens. Suck it up, deal with it.
Right.
But when I was younger, I asked my siblings at the table to eat it, just chew with their mouth closed, for example, because chewing is a really big trigger. And my mom thought I was just trying to boss everyone around, so she told everyone to purposely chew with their mouth open and chew loud. And that was that hurt me pretty bad as a kid. So it was the misdiagnosed, treated for wrong mental illness, meds that I didn't need, and then the mental illnesses that were not treated at all.
Yeah.
That.
So here's my interpretation of what you just told me. So you were circumcised at 8 days. You go through abuse. You go through sexual abuse. You're put on the wrong meds for 6 years after a trial with probably a bunch of other drugs.
Yeah, I've been through them all. If anyone needs advice on meds, just hit me up.
Yeah, well, we'll talk later. But so you go through all this, and then you say, but you were a troubled kid. But, I mean, you seem to have had some anger issues. But this, what you're telling me doesn't seem to me to be that you were really much trouble at all. Like, were you getting arrested? Were you?
No, but I should have been.
Yeah.
I've caused a significant amount of fires in the schools and just trouble like that. But I guess what I meant by trouble was that it was more internally.
Right.
Like, I wasn't this happy kid waking up in the morning and going to school.
Well,
I don't think any
you
kid
were
is
on the
happy.
wrong fucking meds. You were probably not even dreaming.
Wrong meds, wrong place, wrong set of rules. And so I wasn't like a happy kid.
Yeah.
I don't think most kids are happy to go to school.
Yeah.
But even after coming home, I wasn't this happy kid.
Right. So I hope that you don't think that your anger at all justified any mistreatment of you, because
I don't anymore.
That's
But I did.
That's great. Yeah, because I know, anyone I've spoken to that has been abused or has experienced abuse in any form, I know that's often a huge hurdle to get over. And you had this was a boiling pot of so much to be angry about. And it's like you being angry was just a necessary byproduct of what was happening to you. And that I would say, it's hard to believe that you've survived to where you are now. I think it's a testament to how strong the human mind can be, and at withstanding even some of the strongest forms of indoctrination, abuse, and just all right wrongdoing.
Right. All you got to do is focus on logical thinking, rational thinking, and seeing past the big cover up, or not cover, like seeing past the what's blocking your view.
Yeah. Are you gonna go after your abusers?
Like I said earlier, legally, I'm not, most likely probably not. I can't be sure. I know I have until I'm 23 and I'm 21 now.
Yeah.
But legally, I probably won't pursue anything. But I am working on putting together every piece of evidence that I can find, like notes that I wrote when I was a kid, names that I remember, people that I'm talking to about it, and I mean as much as I can. I was young, and even if there were any cameras there, like there's no way I'm gonna get access to that. So I'm putting together whatever I can, and I hope at the very least to come out with my story in details one day.
And are any of your abusers still practicing? And
I looked up a few of them. The summer camp incident was more than one person, and a while later, I looked them up, and even I think it was about a year ago I looked them up, and one was still working at a school working with kids, one was not, and like the guy from the story that I told you earlier, I honestly don't know what ever happened to him. Like I haven't seen him since basically then, since my dad like saw him, and honestly not sure. But no, there were never, like, nothing was ever done. I actually see one of them quite often through a commitment that I have, and I told him a while ago, I still hate you, but I play nice because of the circumstances of where we meet.
Right.
Well, I don't exactly meet him, but we both go to a certain place.
When you say that to him, what do you interpret his internal reaction to be?
Well, he didn't show much.
Right.
I can really read it. I hope he had a mini heart attack.
Yeah. Do you for someone like that, if you were to hear that they had died, would that be a positive thing for you, or would it be like you're pretty neutral to something like that?
Well, I know that if I say it in the public that I would be happy if they died and something ever happens to them, I'd be the obvious blame.
Right.
So I'll say it this way. Yes, I will be happy if they die, but I'm not going to do it, of course.
Yeah.
Because I want my life and I want it outside of prison.
Yeah. And just to be clear, that's why I framed the question like I did, and not that, are you planning on killing these people? No, but I am planning on coming out as soon as I have like the whole timeline and everything like nicely mapped out, and I'm working on it in my free time, so it's not like it's going to be anytime soon, but I am planning on coming out with the exact details and names and everything. Right. So what does your future like for you look like for you? What do you want to do with your life? College, to make up for all the education that I didn't get, which is infuriating on its own, and the way really they keep the indoctrination. So college and travel also. Here and there I do. I'm going to be in Australia in a little over a month. Very cool. Yeah, I'm going to be speaking there at a couple of places, and Limud Oz, Yom Limud Pathways, which is the Australian version of Footsteps. Yep. They do Footsteps is you listeners are probably not familiar. Yeah, fill us in. Yeah, it's the organization that helps people basically choose their own path in life, whether it's religious or not. If you come from a religious indoctrination and you're having trouble leaving that, that's what they're here for. Basically, yeah. I think that their like slogan is "Your life, your journey, your choice," something like that. Right. I'm not sure. So Pathways is the Australian Footsteps, just like there's different organizations in every place where there's Hasidic communities and ultra-Orthodox. So I'm going to be helping them out a little, and so yeah, I'm going to be doing a lot more traveling and just seeing what's out there, getting familiar with more cultures, and taking in everything that I missed. Yeah. Well, I wish you all the best in that. And like I said, reach out anytime you need any help, because I truly believe in pursuing moral justice for people who've been through abuse like you have. So reach out anytime, man. You know how to get a hold of me. So yeah. And I just wanted to add. Go ahead. Since looks like we're in terms of time. I guess a sort of message to other people who, because a lot of people reach out to me and say that similar things happen to them, and there's quite often there's suicidal thoughts involved in the processing of it and all of that. And I just wanted to say that, first of all, you're not alone. This happens to, unfortunately, happen to a lot of people, and happens, and you're not the only one, and there's a way to get past it. I got past it. It took a lot of self-harm, addiction, rehab, hypnosis, and a bunch of things, but there definitely is a way to see yourself on the other end. And if you need help with that, please don't hesitate to reach out on social media or anywhere. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just reach out and understand that there are a lot of people out there that do actively want to help, and I'm one of those people, and it sounds like Ari is too. And there definitely is a way to get to the other side of it. People have done it, so I know that it looks like there isn't, but there definitely is. And from the point where I'm standing, it's clearly visible. So just reach out for help. All right. Well, on that note, Ari, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.